Today we're going to talk about identifying intervals. Here are the elements of an interval we'll be discussing. Let's start with the first one. There are two options for types of interval, harmonic and melodic. Thankfully, they mean pretty much what they sound like. Harmonic intervals make harmony, and melodic intervals make melody. This means that when two notes sound simultaneously, we describe that as a harmonic interval, and if they sound sequentially, we call it a melodic interval. Now what about size? The most important thing to remember when identifying or writing intervals is that we always count inclusively. That means we include the pitches that we start and end on. It is helpful to be extremely comfortable with the musical alphabet both forwards and backwards, so practice that if you aren't quite there yet. If we're looking for the interval from C to F, we count inclusively, C, D, E, F, so the interval is a fourth. If we want B to A, we count B, C, D, E, F, G, A, so the interval is a seventh. It's a simple principle, but very important for accuracy. A neat shortcut is this. Line to line or space to space is an odd-numbered interval. Line to space or space to line is an even-numbered interval. Then you can just measure how far apart they are to keep from having to count every line in space. So you have these options of sizes. If a note is replicated, we call it a unison rather than a first. Unison meaning literally one sound. Rather than an eighth, we call it an octave, from the Latin word for eight, referring to the 8 diatonic pitch classes included in that interval. What if an interval is larger than an octave? It becomes what we call a compound interval. You could count all those lines and spaces between the notes, but I'll give you a shortcut. If you can determine the simple interval between the pitches, then a compound interval is that number plus 7. But if you're adding an octave, why is it 7 and not 8? Because of that really important inclusive counting. An octave includes the pitch 8 steps above the lower note. If you add 8, that means you would be counting that note twice, once from the lower note and again as the new starting point. That's why we add 7, so that the octave pitch is only counted once. This can make things much easier. C to G an octave above? Well, C to G is a fifth, so an extra octave would be 5 plus 7, a 12th. E to G is a third, so an extra octave would be 3 plus 7, a 10th. Direction is pretty straightforward. The interval is either ascending or descending. This really only applies to melodic intervals. So now we get to the good part, quality. Let's start with limiting the options because otherwise it can feel overwhelming. There are 5 possible qualities, but not every interval can be every one. The 5 options are perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. Unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves can only be perfect, augmented, or diminished. Seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths can be major, minor, augmented, or diminished. Notice that there is no such thing as a major fifth or a perfect third, so that removes some possibilities depending on the size. There are multiple ways to determine quality, but some are easier than others. The fastest way is by employing knowledge of key signatures, so if you aren't familiar with those and how the circle of fifths works, go check out that video. It may seem like a lot of work up front, but once you know key signatures, it makes everything about interval quality super simple. It's important to note that when determining quality, we always base it off of the lower of the two notes. In a harmonic interval, that means that we use the key signature of the bottom note. In a melodic interval, we still use the lower note even if the higher note appears first. For now, we'll practice by looking at harmonic intervals. The first step is always to determine the size, since that will inform your options of quality. The next step is to determine the key signature of the lower note and see how the upper note fits or doesn't fit. For unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves, it's fairly simple. If the upper note fits in the key signature of the lower note, then it's a perfect interval. If the upper note is higher than it would be in the key, it is augmented. If it's lower, it's diminished. Of these possibilities, the augmented fourth and diminished fifth are seen with the most frequency. They occupy the same pitch space and have a specific name, the tritone. For seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths, there's an extra step. If the upper note fits in the major key signature of the lower note, then it is major. Remember that the perfect quality does not apply to these intervals. If it doesn't, you've got to determine how far outside the key it lies. If it is higher than it would be in the key, it's augmented. If it's lower, you need to know how much lower. A half step lower makes it a minor interval. A whole step lower makes it a diminished interval. You can shave off part of this step by becoming familiar with the minor key signatures as well. Then you just have to ask, is the top note in the major or minor key signature, and determine the quality that way. If it's bigger than major, it's augmented, and if it's smaller than minor, it's diminished. So let's practice. The first step is to determine the size. D to G is a fourth, so here are our quality options. Is G in the key signature of D major? With an F sharp and a C sharp, we would expect to see a G natural, so yes, that means it's a perfect fourth. How about this one? B flat to D flat is a third, line to line, so we need to check the key. Does D flat happen in the key of B flat major? No, but it does happen in the key of B flat minor. D flat is a half step lower than D, which would happen in B flat major. That means that this is a minor third. Let's do one more. It's a fifth, but does E flat happen in the key of A major? Not with those sharps. So is it higher or lower than it should be? E flat is lower than the E we would expect to see in A major, so this is a diminished fifth. If you're doing melodic intervals, the process is the exact same. You just have to imagine them stacked vertically to use the lower note, and then remember to point out the direction. E to C is a sixth, and E major has 4 sharps, with C sharp being one of them, so we wouldn't see a C natural in this key. C natural is a half step lower than C sharp, and we can't forget the direction, so this is an ascending minor sixth. I strongly recommend cheat sheets to get more fluent with this, but the truth is the only way to get more adept is to practice. That being said, here are 2 flowcharts that outline the process we just practiced. The one on the left focuses more on intervals and only uses major key signatures, while the one on the right assumes fluency with both major and minor key signatures. You can see what I mean about how much simpler this process is if you know your keys. These will be linked in the description. There's one last thing regarding intervals to discuss, and that's inversions. Each of these intervals can be flipped over. C up to E is not the same as E up to C. The good news is you don't have to do the whole process again. The rule for finding inversions is this. The size of the interval and its inversion will add up to 9, and the qualities flip, like this. If you have a third, then inverting it will give you a sixth. 3 plus 6 equals 9. If you have a fourth, inverting it becomes a fifth. 4 plus 5 equals 9. If you have a unison, inverting it becomes an octave. 1 plus 8 equals 9. As far as qualities, augmented inverts with diminished, and major inverts with minor. Perfect is perfect, and doesn't change quality. So D up to F would be a minor third, but F up to D would be a major sixth. G up to C would be a perfect fourth, while C up to G is a perfect fifth. E flat up to B would be an augmented fifth, so B up to E flat would be a diminished fourth. Go forth and practice, and if you have questions or concerns, leave me a note in the comments. I'll see you next time.